James had always lived a life of privilege. Born into a wealthy family, he was the son of a successful real estate mogul and a renowned surgeon, both of whom had high expectations for their only child. His father, Richard Cole, was a respected figure in the real estate world. Known for his sharp business acumen, he not only dealt in properties, but also had a particular passion for collecting rare and valuable antiques, often spending lavishly in markets where old treasures were sold for astronomical sums. His mother, Elizabeth Cole, was one of the finest surgeons in the country, respected and adored by her colleagues and patients alike. The two had built a life of luxury and success, with James enjoying the fruits of their hard work from a very young age. However, despite growing up in such an affluent environment, James was far from arrogant. He was humble and down-to-earth, a rare quality that many found admirable, considering the immense wealth his family possessed. Even though he had access to every material possession imaginable, James never let it define him. Instead, he sought to make the world a better place, driven by a strong sense of responsibility and a desire to help others. From a young age, he understood that the true value of life lay not in money or possessions, but in the impact one could have on others. At the age of 18, James' world was shattered when his mother, Elizabeth, passed away after a long battle with cancer. Her death left an irreplaceable void in his life, and the loss was overwhelming. He and his father, Richard, were left to navigate through life without her, a woman who had not only been a pillar in their family but also a beacon of hope and healing to many others. For a while, it seemed like the grief would consume James. His father, although a strong and practical man, struggled with his own sorrow, and the bond between them, once strong, began to weaken as they both grappled with the loss of their beloved wife and mother. Years went by, and Richard eventually remarried a beautiful woman named Victoria Westbrook. Victoria had a daughter, Catherine, from a previous marriage. Though she was kind and gentle, James had always felt a sense of skepticism toward his new stepmother and stepsister. His father's remarriage left him feeling uneasy, as he feared that their lives might never be the same again. Still, he tried to be civil, and time slowly healed some of his doubts. Despite the changes in his life, James had always been a man of perseverance. He took after his father's business savvy, and when he reached adulthood, he decided to follow in Richard's footsteps and work in real estate. Like his father, James developed a love for collecting antiques, an interest that became a hobby as well as an investment opportunity. He became well-versed in the world of rare artifacts and priceless items. Learning from some of the best in the field, James' business ventures flourished quickly. His keen eye for opportunities and his ability to negotiate helped him secure deals that many others would have never even considered. It wasn't long before he had his own portfolio of properties and a respectable collection of rare antiques. The success he achieved mirrored that of his father, but it was clear that James was different. He didn't flaunt his wealth or use it to build a lavish lifestyle. Instead, he focused on helping others and improving his community. But fate had other plans. Richard, James' father, fell ill after a brief and unexpected illness. Despite all efforts to save him, Richard passed away, leaving James once again alone. The death of his father hit James harder than he had anticipated. It was as though he had lost both parents in a span of just a few years, leaving him with a deep sense of emptiness. He was now the sole surviving member of his immediate family, and the grief was almost too much to bear. Though James had grown closer to his stepmother, Victoria, and stepsister, Catherine, over time, their bond could never replace the connection he had shared with his biological parents. Still, they supported him during his mourning period. Catherine, in particular, was there for him when he felt most alone. She often offered words of comfort and spent time with him when he needed it most. Her genuine care and affection slowly began to break down the walls James had built around himself. Over the next few months, James began to feel a renewed sense of purpose. He moved back into his father's house, a place that once felt empty after his mother's passing, but now was filled with memories of his father. He realized that despite all the sorrow, there was still much to be grateful for. He made it his mission to bring the community together, investing in local schools, roads, and even building a small hospital for the less fortunate. His philanthropic efforts were met with immense gratitude from the community, and James became a beloved figure. People admired him not just for his wealth, but for his kind-hearted nature and dedication to making his hometown a better place. But as time passed, a sudden tragedy would strike once again, changing everything James had worked so hard to build. This time, it would not be a loss of family, but something far more mysterious. Something that would leave even the people closest to him in shock and disbelief. Little did James know, his life was about to take a turn that no one could have anticipated. It was a typical morning in Rosewood, the small town where James Cole had spent most of his life. The air was crisp, and the town, though small, had a certain charm to it. The streets, once empty and worn down, now boasted freshly paved roads, and the schools had been completely renovated thanks to James' contributions. There was a sense of optimism in the air, something James had worked tirelessly to create. Yet, on this particular morning, the mood of Rosewood would shift from contentment to horror. It started when Catherine Westbrook, James' stepsister, arrived at the family home. She had grown close to James over the years, and she knew the house like the back of her hand. As she stepped inside, she was greeted by an eerie silence. She called out for her brother, but there was no response. Assuming he had gone for a walk or was somewhere in the house, Catherine continued to search for him. She eventually found James in the study, lying motionless on the floor. At first, she thought he might have fallen asleep, but as she knelt beside him, a cold sense of dread washed over her. James was pale, his body cold to the touch. Her heart sank as she realized that something was terribly wrong. She immediately rushed to his side, desperately trying to revive him, but it was no use. James was dead. Panic set in as Catherine called the paramedics, hoping beyond hope that they would be able to save him. But when the paramedics arrived, they too were unable to revive him. They could not determine a cause of death, and for a moment, it seemed like James had simply vanished from this world without explanation. The medical team was left stumped, unable to find any clear signs of trauma or illness that could have caused his sudden death. The town was thrown into a state of disbelief. James Cole, the kind-hearted philanthropist who had done so much for the community, was gone in an instant. The townspeople were shocked, unable to come to terms with the loss. Catherine, despite her grief, took charge of the situation, as her stepbrother had no immediate family left other than her and Victoria Westbrook, her mother. Together, they made arrangements for his funeral. But in the back of Catherine's mind, there was something she couldn't shake, a lingering feeling that something wasn't right. Catherine had always known that James had a slight heart condition, but he had been under medical care and was taking medication to manage it. Catherine recalled how, just a few months before his death, James had complained of chest pains, but he had brushed it off, saying it was nothing serious. At the time, she had chalked it up to stress or overwork. But now, with his sudden death, she couldn't help but wonder if there was more to it than just a heart condition. Despite the doctor's conclusions that James had died of natural causes, Catherine couldn't let go of her suspicions. She knew her brother had always been against autopsies, believing that they violated a person's dignity. He had always held on to the belief that once someone had passed, they should be left in peace. Catherine respected that belief, but she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something else was at play. After much thought, Catherine made the decision not to request an autopsy. She believed that his heart condition, combined with the stress he had been under, was enough to explain his death. However, her mind was not at ease. She began researching alternative ways to find answers, convinced that there was something more to his sudden passing. Late one night, as Catherine sat at her desk, she stumbled upon an article that seemed to hold the key to everything. The article was about scientists who were conducting research on the bodies of the deceased, studying them for medical purposes. The idea was to study the bodies for extended periods to understand what happens after death. It was not something Catherine had ever considered, but after reading through the article, she realized that this could be her chance to get the answers she so desperately needed. Determined to honor James in the way he would have wanted, Catherine contacted the scientists mentioned in the article. She explained the situation and offered to donate James' body for research. In return, the scientists promised her compensation, which she agreed to direct to a local orphanage, something James would have wanted. The arrangement was made, and the next day, Catherine signed the necessary documents, giving her consent for the research. The funeral service for James was held a few days later at St. Mary's Church in Rosewood. The church was filled with people, each one mourning the loss of a man who had touched their lives in ways they would never forget. Catherine, though devastated by the loss, put on a brave face for the sake of the community and the memory of her brother. As the funeral ceremony came to a close, the pallbearers lifted James' casket and began to carry it to the hearse. But just before they closed the casket, the scientists, who had been quietly observing the ceremony, approached with a camera. They had installed the camera inside the casket, planning to study James' body over the course of the next year. The camera was designed to transmit live footage to their computers, giving them the opportunity to document every moment as part of their research. With the camera in place, the casket was sealed, and James' final journey began. Catherine, although conflicted about allowing the scientists to study her brother, knew that this was what James would have wanted. He had always been passionate about scientific progress, and she hoped that this research would provide answers to the many questions surrounding his unexpected death. As the days passed, life in Rosewood slowly returned to normal. People continued to speak of James' good deeds and his contributions to the town, but Catherine couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. Little did she know, the mystery surrounding James' death was far from over, and the discovery that awaited the scientists would send shockwaves through the entire town. Days passed, and life in Rosewood began to regain its normal rhythm. Catherine Westbrook continued with the arrangements her brother had set up before his untimely death. She spent time in his now empty home, struggling with the overwhelming loss. Her heart ached every time she walked through the rooms, where the laughter and life of James had once filled the space. Yet, there was an unease that gnawed at her, one that she couldn't quite shake off. Meanwhile, the scientists who had agreed to study James Cole's body were eagerly awaiting the first glimpse of the footage from the camera inside the casket. They had set up their equipment at their research facility, an old, converted building just outside Rosewood, designed to handle such investigations. The camera they had placed inside the casket was designed to transmit live footage for an entire year, capturing any changes in the body. It was meant to observe the decomposition process, but none of them expected what they were about to witness. One evening, as the clock struck 7 p.m., the first transmission from the camera began to stream onto the screens in the research facility. The scientists gathered around, watching intently as the footage came through. They were accustomed to the usual recordings of the slow, inevitable process of decomposition, but this time was different. What they saw shocked them to their core. The first frames were eerily still, the camera capturing nothing but the inside of the casket. But as the footage continued, something startling happened. James Cole's body, once lying lifeless, began to show signs of movement. It was subtle at first. His fingers twitched, and then his chest seemed to rise and fall, as if he were taking shallow breaths. The scientists stared in disbelief, unsure of what they were seeing. The footage was clear, and there was no doubt about it. James was alive. The camera had been placed inside the casket after the funeral, and it was only after several hours that the real shock set in. James Cole had not died of natural causes. Instead, he had been drugged, most likely by his stepsister Catherine, who had been desperate to find the hidden antiques that James had collected over the years. Catherine had convinced herself that if James were out of the picture, she would be able to take possession of his treasures. What she hadn't expected was for her brother to survive the drugging, only to wake up in the suffocating darkness of his own casket. Realizing the gravity of the situation, the scientists quickly copied the footage and rushed to the local Rosewood police station. They were prepared to explain the situation, but the police had no idea how to process the information. As the footage was shown to the officers, their initial shock gave way to immediate action. They knew that James must still be alive, and if he were not already gone, he needed to be rescued immediately. At the same time, Catherine was at home, trying to carry on with her life, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. She poured herself a glass of expensive tequila, trying to drown out the guilt she felt for what she had done. But just as she took a sip, a loud siren interrupted her thoughts. She froze for a moment, hearing the unmistakable sound of police cars approaching. A moment later, the sound of heavy footsteps on her front porch sent a chill through her body. Catherine felt a knot form in her stomach as she walked cautiously to the door. When she opened it, she was met by 2 officers from the Rosewood Police Department. They wasted no time with pleasantries. "Miss Catherine Westbrook, we need to speak with you," one officer said, his tone serious. At first, Catherine tried to maintain her composure, offering the officers a nervous smile. "How can I help you, officers?" she asked, though her hands began to shake. "We're here to investigate the death of James Cole," the officer continued. "There's been some new information brought to light, and we have reason to believe you may be involved in his death." Catherine's heart stopped. She tried to hide the panic rising within her, but couldn't keep her hands from trembling. She quickly tried to cover her fear, standing in the doorway and blocking their path. "What are you talking about?" "I don't know what you're talking about," she insisted. But the officers were not to be deterred. They asked to enter the house, and Catherine, despite her best efforts, knew she had no choice but to let them in. As they began their search, the weight of her guilt hung heavily in the air. In her mind, she could already hear the footage playing, the moment the scientists had discovered that James was alive. Catherine's worst fears were beginning to materialize, and she knew there was no way to undo what had been done. The officer, his voice tinged with suspicion, finally turned to her. "We've seen the footage. Miss Westbrook, James Cole is alive. He was never dead. You drugged him." In that moment, Catherine's world collapsed. She tried to hold on to the lie, but it all came crashing down. She knew the truth had come out, with no way to avoid the consequences. She confessed everything, how she had drugged James Coffin, hoping to find the hidden treasures. But when she saw he wasn't breathing, she panicked. She fabricated the story of James' heart condition and even forged medical documents to cover up her crime. But Catherine's confession didn't end there. She admitted that, after he had died in her eyes, she had arranged for the scientists to study his body, hoping it would give her a sense of closure. What she hadn't anticipated was that James would wake up and struggle for survival, trapped in the very casket she had sealed him in. As Catherine finished her confession, the door to the house suddenly opened, and there stood James Cole, alive, but visibly shaken. The sight of him standing before her was more than Catherine could bear. She fell to her knees, overwhelmed with remorse. The police immediately took Catherine into custody, and the truth about her actions spread throughout Rosewood. The town, once full of admiration for James, now had to reconcile with the shocking betrayal from one of their own. Catherine was charged with attempted murder, and her trial was soon underway. As for James, though deeply hurt by his stepsister's actions, he chose to focus on the future. He had nearly lost his life, but he was determined to live it in a way that would honor the love and kindness he had always tried to offer. Rosewood would always remember the day James Cole came back from the dead, a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected twists of fate can turn lives upside down.